Hello again, it's me. As a longtime fan of Berserk, I couldn't let this chapter pass me by without talking about it, so here I am. Last chapter revealed a lot about the world of Berserk and its history, and Guts had a vision of a previous eclipse that the Skull Knight had experienced, along with a woman who had the brand of sacrifice. Void was present, and he was accompanied by an entirely new god hand that we had never seen before, with some really interesting designs. Mira did a really good job designing them. I really hope we get to learn more about them because they really interest me. So in this chapter we get to see Guts and Shirka's reactions to all that. Guts figures out that what he saw in the vision was in fact an eclipse that seems to have been caused by Void, who likely has a long history with Skull Knight. This chapter confirms the fact that the Skull Knight shares a lot of parallels with Guts, and that Skull Knight is essentially the Guts or the struggler of his generation. Though in Skull Knight's case, he was a king, and a king who took over the entirety of the known world at the time. So his struggle, I imagine, was an attempt to unify the entire world under one banner. And I'm not quite sure where Void falls into this, but I'm pretty sure that Skull Knight and Void both knew each other before Void had become a god hand. Also, the question of why the Skull Knight would even need the Berserker armor comes to mind, since he had it on before the eclipse, so he likely had to face apostles and similar enemies before the eclipse even happened. There's just a lot about this character that intrigues me, and for every piece of information that we get, only more questions are raised, and that's something that I really appreciate about how Miura gives information and revelations. He never stops piquing my interest in the world of Berserk and its characters. I'm really interested in hearing more about the Skull Knight's story and how he came to be how he is now, how he became this dead man stalking the endless night, as he put it. The Skull Knight has always sort of been this example of what happens to a person when they embrace their inner darkness and the Berserker armor completely consumes them, and this chapter confirms that idea. So the Skull Knight leads Guts and the others into a mausoleum, which houses the grave of the Skull Knight's beloved, who is known as the Priestess of the Cherry Blossoms, which is a very fancy title, I've got to say. But she was the woman that the Skull Knight was holding in Guts' vision, and it was shown that she had the brand of sacrifice. So we don't really know how she died exactly, or if she even survived the eclipse, but it seems to me that she died of natural causes in Elfhelm. Since she had the brand of sacrifice, it would make sense for the Skull Knight to bring her there, and Elfhelm seems to be safe from all apostles or other entities that are drawn to the brand. And it ties into why Skull Knight led Guts into Elfhelm, as Skull Knight himself was faced with a similar situation in which he had to protect his beloved and take her to a place where she'd be able to live peacefully, despite having the brand of sacrifice. So that's just a little connection I made. I wouldn't really call it a theory, but I think it would tie in very nicely with what we already know. But this is all assuming that she didn't die in the eclipse, which is also possible. Another interesting fact is that Danan, the Queen of the Elves, looks just like the Skull Knight's beloved, and Shirka even makes light of this, so that raises even more questions as to how she and Danan are related. She could be a relative or something else entirely, but we'll just have to wait and see for that to be cleared up. The Skull Knight definitely has a history with her though, and he tells her that he is no longer what he once was, and that all he is the remnant of the grudge left by his previous self, that grudge being directed towards Void and the God Hand. He only has one aim, which is getting revenge on the God Hand and killing them by any means possible. He is an individual who was consumed by his vengeance and has lost his humanity as a result, which once again parallels Guts, and further raises the possibility that he could one day end up just like him if the Beast of Darkness takes hold of him completely, and if he continues to use the Berserker armor, which has already taken a massive toll on Guts. He's even lost some of his senses. So the parallels are all there, which ties into the themes of causality and fate, and how history tends to repeat itself in a constant cycle. It seems that Void is to Skull Knight, as Griffith is to Guts, and the same goes with Casca and Skull Knight's beloved. But Guts, as the struggler, is someone who outwardly challenges and defies fate, so changing or diverting from what causality has decided is in Guts' hands. The Skull Knight knows this, which is why he's been helping Guts along the way, and I'm anticipating what comes of it all since Guts has finally gotten what he wanted, and not quite in the way he wanted, but he can now move forward from here. Another fact that's revealed is that Flora, Shirke's mentor, had served under the Skull Knight's lover and was connected to both of them before the eclipse. But she was exiled from Elfhelm for violating a taboo, which could have to do with the Skull Knight's current state. It's likely that the Skull Knight was being consumed by the Berserker armor, and it was because of Flora's intervention that he was able to survive it in the state that he is in now, if you can even call it surviving. Then the chapter sort of gets interrupted by this very infamous Isidro section, which I admit is funny, but it just really overstays its welcome. Isidro essentially gets into a fight with the witches, and it's entertaining for a bit, and it's, it's Isidro, but it just goes on for way too long, in my opinion, but it is what it is. It certainly didn't ruin the chapter for me or anything, it's just something that needed to be addressed, and a lot of people are complaining about it, but, whatever. After all that, Guts makes a very telling statement, and he kind of says what I've been thinking myself about this island. He is a character that is constantly moving forward and doesn't wish to stay stagnant in the same place. The thought of Griffith returns to his mind, and he knows that he has unfinished business to settle, which doesn't necessarily mean he's still seeking revenge. I think he just wants closure with Griffith. Like, I would want at least a conversation with him if I were Guts. He really is aimless here, and has been out of place on this island the moment he set foot here. He clearly doesn't want to stay on this island for much longer, and to be honest, I don't either. I want us to move on to someplace new. Of course not immediately, there's still a lot that we need to find out before we leave here, but Guts and I are of the same mind here. And then in probably the most important moment in this chapter, the Moonlight Child finally shows up to Guts and steps forward to him, which is quite the cliffhanger to leave this chapter on. I can only imagine how this interaction is going to go between Guts and his child, which he hasn't seen in a long time, who also happens to be Griffith at the same time. The story can really go in any direction from here, but I can tell that the next chapter is going to be integral to where Guts and the story itself is going to move forward from here. So I very much look forward to the next chapter and seeing how Guts' confrontation with the child goes, because the possibilities really are endless. As always, thank you for sticking with me, and I hope you'll stick around for the next one.